Hi everyone, my name is Pauline Barlier and I am a senior at UCLA with a major in global studies and a minor in film, television, and digital media, and the name of the project I'll be presenting today is Fractured Screens, French Cinema and the Distorted Memory of the Algerian War. So the main question guiding my research is how does France's inability to confront its colonial guilt manifest itself through decades of cinematic silence and distortion in regards to the Algerian War of Independence? So in order to answer this question, I look at 24 films from different time periods, various scholarly works, and as I am also fluent in French, I was able to conduct 3 different interviews with French directors who were each involved with producing and releasing their own films about the Algerian War for the past 50 years. So to provide more historical context on the conflict in France at the time, the Algerian War of Independence occurred from 1954 to 1962. Algeria had been a colony of France and integral territory since 1830, so this was a very violent anti-colonial conflict where about 1.5 million French conscripts were sent to suppress this fight for independence, and it was a very divisive issue within France. So right after the end of the war and the Evian Accords, where Algeria finally achieved independence, there was a sort of memory crisis, as scholars like Henry Rousseau describes, where Algeria and the Algeria question becomes a sort of suppressed national trauma, just as Vichy France was, which describes the French collaborationist regime during World War II, which was basically the puppet state of Nazi Germany. And this delay and erasure from national thought and discourse is also a structural reality in France, as most classified documents aren't released until about 50 years. So my project explores what happens in those 50 years and what stories are being told and how that affects national memory by examining cinema and what films were distributed at that time. So to trace how French cinema regarding the conflict evolves over time, I break it down into 3 key periods. So first, there's the direct post-war period from around the 1950s to the 1970s, where there's a lot of censorship and general erasure of Algerian bodies, spaces, and narratives. And then it shifts to the banlieues in the 1970s to the 1990s, which describes the urban peripheral areas within France that house large immigrant and post-colonial communities. And then this sort of delayed reckoning in the 2000s to present period and delayed return to Algeria and the Algeria question itself, with certain exceptions. So for the first period, from the 1950s to the 1970s, we see what scholar Leslie Hill calls filming ghosts. All of these films from French directors about Algeria, produced directly following the war, were either censored, banned, or structurally avoided the conflict altogether. J'habite on the far right is the best example of this phenomenon, the name meaning I'm 8 years old, as it's a film that depicts Algerian children in Tunisian refugee camps recounting the tragic events that they have experienced in the war from drawings they made themselves. This film was released in 1961 but seized 17 times and banned for over a decade, which shows how the war and Algerian perspectives were highly repressed in French national discourse and memory at the time. Films released during this time period also structurally and narratively avoided Algeria altogether. This becomes especially clear in Muriel ou le temps d'un retour, which means Muriel or the time of a return, created by well-renowned film director Alain Resnais in 1963. So in this film, the character Muriel is supposed to be a young girl that was tortured and murdered during the Algerian War, but she is never shown on screen, and her story is never really revealed, only discussed indirectly through fragmented narration and memory. So we get this paradox in that the film is about her and it names her as its title, but it structurally erases her. So Muriel becomes a metaphor for Algeria itself at that time in France, named but avoided, never seen, and never discussed. This silence becomes even more striking when we look at the issue of torture. Torture was widely known to have occurred during the war, and yet it was systematically pushed out of public visibility. As you can see through this quote from a colonel quoting President de Gaulle's orders in Algiers in 1959 to French conscripts saying, "Stop torturing, but carry on torturing all the same." So works at the time that tried to address this issue of torture faced a lot of censorship and backlash. For one of my filmmaker interviews, I had the opportunity to speak with director Laurent Heinemann, who produced the adaptation for La Question, which is based on Henri Alleg's memoir, the first book that was banned in France since the 18th century from a French journalist who supported the Algerian independence movement and therefore was tortured and imprisoned by the French government for years. Heinemann's adaptation was released in 1977, and although he didn't depict any violence or scenes of torture in an effort to educate a more general audience and younger populations, it was still restricted to an audience of 18 and above, which was very disappointing for him. It was only re-released in 2001 to a general audience. In addition, the reception in France was very harsh. Tear gas were thrown at the theater screens projecting this film, which just shows what public discourse on the topic was like at that time. So in the second period, from the 1970s to the 1990s, Algeria isn't erased, but displaced to the banlieues of France. The banlieues being the suburban areas of major French cities, often home to different immigrant and post-colonial communities, such as the ones listed below. What's important to note here is that the dynamics of colonial violence are reproduced within France itself. So the banlieue becomes what we might think of as an internal colony. This is a list of some seminal banlieue film works, La Haine being one of the most iconic French films of all time, which depicts police violence, surveillance, and social tension, kind of reflecting on how these unresolved colonial legacies plagued French society, and shining a light on the immorality of the French police force and therefore government for the first time. So instead of confronting Algeria directly, French cinema displaces that history onto the domestic space. So this is just a collection of stills and images from these banlieue films, capturing the atmosphere of tension, violence, and the lived realities of displaced post-colonial communities. The gun being held at the Eiffel Tower perhaps being the most symbolic image here. So the third key period occurs from the 2000s to the present, where we begin to see a real shift. For the first time, Algerian bodies, spaces, and voices appear on screen, which happens in different ways through showing repressed guilt, brutal warfare tactics, and centering stories around Algerian voices and perspectives, like with Bourjamila. However, this is still a delayed confrontation with the past and partial, as it is marked by certain limitations. So for my filmmaker interviews, I was also able to speak with François Luciani and Caroline Huppert, who directed and released films about the Algerian War recently in 2003 and 2011. So in François Luciani's experience, he wanted to film many scenes in Algeria, however that was not possible due to pushback from the Algerian government. Therefore, he filmed most of his scenes in Morocco, using Moroccan comedians, and then dubbing their voices over with Algerian actors in France to reproduce the Algerian accents, which shows the complications of telling Algeria's story on Algerian land with Algerian voices, because it does come from a French perspective, the colonizer. Caroline Huppert had the same remarks for her film. Many of her scenes had to be filmed in Morocco, and she said it took a lot of courage to create a film about this conflict and release it in France at that time, since the topic was still so sensitive. So across the three key periods I've discussed, we see a clear trajectory, first with erasure and censorship, then the displacement into the banlieues, and finally a delayed return to Algeria. So cinema in this sense becomes more than storytelling. It becomes a historical record of what society is able or unable to face. But this progress comes with certain limits, which reflects an ongoing discomfort with confronting colonial violence. This can be especially seen with Algeria's amended law created in 2026, which criminalizes French colonial rule and holds them legally responsible, showing this is still a very open wound. Thank you for listening.